The boarding agent smiled. "Good morning." "First class is boarding now." "Thank you," the woman replied, offering a warm smile before taking her boarding pass. The terminal buzzed with rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and hurried conversations. Business travelers checked phones. Families gathered children. Everything looked ordinary, moving with practiced rhythm. As the woman stepped toward the first-class lane, a middle-aged man glanced up from his laptop. A couple waiting nearby looked at her, then quietly at each other. "She's in first class?" the woman whispered. Her husband shrugged. "Maybe." The woman heard them, but kept walking. Confidence had become part of her life long ago. She had learned that answering every doubtful look only gave it more power. Some people judged before introductions. Others judged before eye contact. The boarding agent scanned another passenger. "You're all set." "Sir." The man smiled politely and walked aboard. The woman reached the counter. "Good morning," she said, before the boarding pass even changed hands. Another flight attendant standing near the aircraft door noticed her. Her friendly expression faded for only a second, then returned, carefully controlled. "Who's next?" she asked. "The first-class passenger," the boarding agent answered. The attendant's eyes settled on the woman longer than necessary. The woman noticed. "So did something change?" she asked gently. "No," the attendant replied. "Just a routine check." The words sounded harmless, yet something behind them felt different. Several passengers waiting nearby stopped, pretending not to watch. Nobody interrupted. Nobody smiled. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. The woman rested both hands around her boarding pass, calm and patient. She had seen this kind of hesitation before. She also knew that moments like these rarely began with raised voices. They almost always began with a quiet look that silently questioned whether someone truly belonged. Continue with scene 2. Exactly. 300 words. Where the flight attendant checks the boarding pass twice and quiet suspicion begins taking control. Where the flight attendant checks the boarding pass twice and quiet suspicion begins taking control. Here's the next scene. Continuing directly from the previous one, the flight attendant accepted the boarding pass without another word. Her eyes scanned the name once, then again. She turned it over, glanced at the screen, and looked back at the woman's face. The welcoming smile she had offered everyone else quietly disappeared. "Is something wrong?" the woman asked, "Just verifying a few details?" "My ticket hasn't changed. We still need to verify." A businessman standing nearby frowned but stayed silent. Two passengers behind him exchanged uneasy glances before looking away. Nobody questioned why every other first-class traveler had boarded within seconds while this inspection continued. The woman waited calmly, refusing to fill the silence with nervous explanations. Years of quiet endurance had taught her that dignity often sounded softer than suspicion. The attendant studied her again. "You're traveling alone?" "Yes. For business?" The woman smiled politely. "I'm traveling because I have a reservation." The answer hung between them. Another passenger whispered, "This is taking longer than it should." His companion muttered, "Don't get involved." Their voices faded, but their silence remained. The attendant tapped her tablet without checking the full reservation history. She nodded to herself as though an invisible question had already been answered. "I'm afraid there's been a seating adjustment." The woman looked at the boarding pass still resting in the attendant's hand. "My confirmation says seat 2A. The system has reassigned you." "May I ask when that happened?" "It happens sometimes." No explanation followed. No apology came. Several witnesses lowered their eyes. Instead of meeting hers, the woman drew one slow breath. Before speaking again, "Could you please tell me why my confirmed seat changed?" The question was gentle. It carried no anger. Yet the entire boarding lane fell silent. Because everyone understood the answer mattered far more than the seat itself. Even before the attendant quietly replied, "I'm afraid that's no longer your seat. If you'd like, I can continue with the next exactly 300-word scene that begins immediately after the attendant's statement, maintaining seamless continuity and no repetition." Here's the next scene. Continuing seamlessly from the previous moment, the attendant lowered the boarding pass and stepped aside. "Please follow me," she said, her voice flat. Moments earlier, she had welcomed another first-class passenger with a bright smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Harrison. It's wonderful to have you with us." She'd even helped him place his briefcase inside the overhead compartment. Now, standing before the black woman, she offered nothing beyond clipped instructions. This way, the difference was impossible to miss. The woman answered softly, "Thank you." No reply came. The attendant avoided her eyes and walked ahead without slowing. Every movement felt practiced. Careful enough to appear professional, while quietly withholding the warmth freely given to everyone else. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband. "Did you notice that?" He hesitated. "I did." She greeted everyone. "I know." Neither spoke another word. Around them, passengers adjusted jackets, opened laptops, and pretended to focus elsewhere. The silence spread through the cabin, not because nobody noticed, but because speaking required courage that comfort rarely offered. Near the window, a businessman closed the file he had been reading. His attention never left the aisle. He replayed every exchange in his mind, comparing smiles, voices, pauses, and expressions. None of it felt accidental. The woman reached the reassigned seat. "It's perfectly fine," she said quietly. Nobody believed she meant the seat. She placed her handbag beneath the chair, smoothed her jacket, and sat with calm dignity. Her composure carried more weight than any complaint could have. The businessman slowly reached into his pocket. Without attracting attention, he unlocked his phone. His thumb hovered above the camera icon for one brief second. Then he pressed record. Across the cabin, conversations continued as though nothing unusual had happened, yet one silent recording had already begun preserving every moment that others hoped would simply disappear. Forever. The aircraft door closed. With a solid click that echoed through the cabin, safety announcements began, yet they barely covered the silence left behind by the boarding incident. Passengers settled into their seats, but the uncomfortable feeling remained, heavier than the sound of engines preparing for departure. The woman rested her hands in her lap and looked out the window. The view reminded her of countless flights over the years, different airports, different cities. The same careful smiles that sometimes disappeared the moment people looked beyond her. Boarding pass and saw only her skin. She quietly exhaled. "You've seen this before?" she whispered to herself. The words carried no bitterness, only truth. She refused to replay the moment with anger. Experience had taught her that someone else's prejudice did not deserve control over her peace. She straightened her jacket, closed her eyes briefly, and welcomed the calm she had fought years to protect. Near the front, the flight attendant organized paperwork with quiet satisfaction. "Everything's settled," she murmured. Another attendant nodded without asking questions. She believed she had protected first-class standards. The possibility that she had judged a passenger instead of following policy never entered her mind. Confidence covered every unanswered doubt. Across the aisle, the businessman lowered his phone but kept recording discreetly. A young couple noticed the difference in the crew's behavior now more than the woman herself. "Something feels wrong?" the husband whispered. "I think she was treated differently," his wife answered. Neither looked away this time. Near the galley, a senior flight attendant studied the passenger list, then lifted her eyes toward the woman. Her expression tightened. She stepped closer to another crew member and spoke so quietly only one person could hear. "Are you absolutely sure that's her?" The question drained the color from the attendant's face before either of them spoke another word. The whispered question near the galley refused to leave the cabin. The attendant forced herself to continue working, but her hands no longer moved with the same confidence. Across the aisle, the businessman kept recording, unaware that the truth stretched far beyond this single flight. Months earlier, another passenger had stood at a different boarding gate holding back tears after being questioned 3 times about a valid first-class ticket. She filed a complaint. A supervisor thanked her politely, promised a review, and quietly closed the file without disciplinary action. She was not the only one. An elderly couple remembered watching a Latino businessman receive similar treatment. They discussed reporting what they had seen, but convinced themselves someone else surely would. Nobody ever did. Inside airline offices, complaint forms traveled from one department to another. Every email received a courteous response. "We appreciate your feedback. We take these matters seriously. Your concerns have been forwarded." The words sounded reassuring, yet the reports disappeared into endless procedures where signatures replaced solutions. Managers worried that acknowledging discrimination would damage the airline's reputation more than ignoring repeated warnings. During crew breaks, whispers often replaced official discussions. "She treats certain passengers differently. I've noticed it too. So why doesn't anyone report it? I have a family. I'm not risking my job." Those conversations always ended the same way, with uncomfortable silence. Over time, subtle prejudice stopped looking unusual because nobody challenged it consistently. Every isolated incident seemed too small to justify serious consequences. Together, however, they formed a pattern hiding behind professional uniforms and practiced smiles. That pattern remained buried until an internal auditor reviewing archived complaints paused over a forgotten report filed almost 3 years earlier. The wording felt disturbingly familiar: passenger reassigned without explanation, repeated identity, verification, different treatment from surrounding travelers. The similarities could no longer be ignored. Back at headquarters, quiet conversations replaced confident excuses. Didn't we investigate this before? I don't think we actually did. What if today's incident isn't an exception? Nobody answered immediately. Meanwhile, high above the clouds, the aircraft carried more than passengers. It carried years of ignored warnings. Today's confrontation had not created the airline's problem. It had simply become the moment when silence finally lost its ability to hide the truth from everyone watching, while the aircraft continued climbing through the clouds. Another story quietly unfolded beyond the cabin. At airline headquarters, polished posters lined the employee hallways. Smiling faces of every background stood beneath bold promises: respect every passenger. Every flight, every time. The message looked inspiring, yet many employees passed those posters without slowing. Knowing the words often ended at the wall, every new crew member attended the same training. Every customer deserves equal treatment, the instructor would say. Bias has no place in this airline. The room always nodded. The manuals were thorough. The presentations were polished. The examples were reassuring. Yet no training slide could predict the choices people made when assumptions quietly replaced facts. Several experienced attendants remembered similar moments. I saw it happen before. One admitted during an old break room conversation. So why didn't you report it? Another asked. The answer came after a long pause. I needed this job. That sentence explained more than any policy ever could. Over time, many employees learned that questioning coworkers often created bigger problems than ignoring questionable behavior. Promotions slowed. Schedules changed. Friendships disappeared. Silence became less frightening than honesty. Back on board, a newly hired flight attendant stood near the galley. Unable to stop thinking about what she had witnessed, she leaned toward a senior colleague. Can I ask you something? The woman glanced around first. What is it? Did that feel wrong to you? The senior attendant looked toward the reassigned passenger before answering. It did. So why didn't anyone say anything? Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Because everyone notices first. Nobody wants to speak first. Those words lingered between them. Soon, several crew members stopped watching the passengers and quietly began watching one another instead. The attendant who had reassigned the seat sensed unfamiliar eyes following her movements, though nobody openly challenged her. The airline had spent years building a reputation around inclusion and respect. Yet those values were never truly tested by advertising campaigns or employee handbooks. They were tested in ordinary moments when no manager appeared to be watching. Long before investigators reviewed reports or executives requested explanations, the truth had already revealed itself, not through policies, not through slogans, but through the quiet choices ordinary people made when character mattered more than procedure. The words spoken near the galley faded, but they left the cabin feeling different. Nobody returned to reading magazines or staring out the windows quite the same way. The silence had changed. It no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to reflection. The woman remained composed, unaware that others had quietly begun searching their own memories instead of questioning her presence. Across the aisle, a young father looked toward his 2 children sleeping beside him. The scene carried him back 8 years. During a family vacation, an airline employee had stopped him 3 separate times to verify his ticket while his children watched. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" His daughter had whispered. He had forced a smile. "No, sweetheart." Everything's fine. It had never been fine. A few rows ahead, an elderly woman lowered her eyes. She remembered another flight decades earlier when an immigrant passenger had been moved without explanation. Nobody had objected then either. She had told herself it was probably a misunderstanding. Looking back now, that explanation felt painfully convenient. Different faces, different years, the same uneasy question remained. Was it discrimination? Or did I imagine it? That uncertainty had followed many passengers home long after their flights ended. An elderly husband slowly reached for his wife's hand. We saw this once before," he murmured. She nodded. "We should have spoken." "I know. I've regretted it ever since." Neither tried defending their silence anymore. Instead of watching the woman, they quietly observed everyone else's reactions. They finally understood that injustice often survived because ordinary people waited for someone braver to speak first. No speeches followed, no applause filled the cabin. Yet, sympathy quietly changed direction. Passengers, who had once trusted the attendant without question now, watched her every movement instead. She continued serving drinks, completely unaware that confidence had quietly left the room. Each remembered story strengthened another. Separate experiences slowly connected into something impossible to dismiss. The businessman continued. Recording, the young father remained watchful. The elderly couple refused to look away. Again, without arguments, accusations, or dramatic confrontations, strangers began recognizing the same invisible wound in one another. The aircraft still flew peacefully above the clouds, but inside the cabin, shared understanding had already become the first quiet step toward justice. Long before anyone on the ground would learn what had happened that morning, the businessman lowered his phone only after the upload bar reached 100%. He slipped the device into his jacket as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the aisle, the woman sat with her hands folded, looking through the window instead of toward the people who had quietly judged her. She had no idea that someone had already chosen to stand beside her without saying a single word. A flight attendant rolled the beverage cart forward with practiced confidence. "Coffee or tea, ma'am?" "Tea, please." "Thank you." The exchange sounded perfectly ordinary. Anyone joining the flight at that moment would never guess what had happened minutes earlier. The cabin had returned to its familiar rhythm, but beneath the calm surface, something irreversible had already begun. Far below, phones across the country buzzed with notifications. A short caption accompanied the video. "Watch carefully." The loudest discrimination is often the quietest. Within minutes, strangers began sharing it. "I noticed the way she looked at her ticket." "Why did she check it twice?" "My mother went through this." "I thought I was imagining it when it happened to me." Each new comment pulled another forgotten story into the light. People were not arguing over dramatic insults. They were recognizing familiar expressions, pauses, and assumptions that had followed them for years. Inside the aircraft, the attendant continued smiling at other first-class passengers. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" "I'm fine," the businessman replied. Studying her carefully, she smiled politely and moved on, completely unaware that thousands of strangers were now studying the same smile from another perspective. Back at airline headquarters, the public relations office received an unexpected alert. "We're getting tagged hundreds of times." "What happened?" "I'm not sure yet." "Find out before this gets bigger." Another employee refreshed the screen. "It's already getting bigger." Meanwhile, journalists began sending emails requesting comments. The executives exchanged worried looks. "Contact the flight. It's already airborne. Then notify operations. We still don't know exactly what happened. That won't matter if everyone else thinks they do." Back inside the cabin, no announcement interrupted the flight. No confrontation erupted. Passengers remained seated, reading magazines, watching movies, or staring quietly ahead. Yet the balance had changed. Authority still wore the uniform. Truth belonged to the witnesses. The camera had captured every hesitation, every expression, every unnecessary pause. It had not exaggerated anything or chosen a side. It simply remembered what people often hoped others would forget. For the first time that morning, the story no longer depended on someone's version of events. It depended on evidence, and evidence had already begun traveling much faster than the airplane itself. The realization that evidence now existed outside the aircraft changed everything, but inside airline headquarters, another discovery quietly raised the stakes even higher. While executives worried about the growing attention online, a customer service supervisor reopened the passenger manifest, hoping to understand why one ordinary flight had suddenly become the center of so many urgent messages. His eyes stopped on a single reservation. "Wait," he whispered. The employee beside him looked over. "What is it?" "I know this name." He clicked deeper into the reservation file. The booking was valid. The payment history was complete. Every security check had cleared. Nothing appeared unusual until he reached the confidential account notes. His expression changed. "Open the archived profile." Another supervisor frowned. "Why?" "Just do it." Seconds later, the older record appeared. The room grew noticeably quieter. This can't be right. It matches? Check it again. They reviewed every detail twice. The information remained unchanged. One manager stepped closer. Has anyone contacted the aircraft? Not yet. Do it now. The operations desk immediately called flight communications. We need to speak with the captain. What's the emergency? I can't explain over this line. Just connect us. The request moved through normal procedures, but every transfer consumed precious minutes. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued climbing. Inside the cabin, passengers accepted refreshments while quiet conversations returned. Nothing suggested that several departments on the ground were suddenly working against the clock. Back at headquarters, unanswered calls increased the tension. Any response? Still waiting. Try again. Nearby employees sensed something unusual without knowing the reason. One asked softly, "Is this about the video?" "No, it's bigger than that." A supervisor studied the reservation once more before speaking almost to himself. "Please tell me this isn't the same." "Passenger?" Nobody answered. Their silence confirmed. More than words could. Across the operations center, voices became whispers. Phones rang more often. Computer screens displaying the reservation were turned away from curious eyes. Managers stopped discussing routine schedules and focused entirely on one flight. Far above them, the flight attendant continued serving passengers with quiet confidence. She believed the earlier disagreement had ended the moment the woman accepted the reassigned seat. She never noticed that control had already begun slipping away. The woman remained calm, looking out the window with the same quiet dignity she had carried since boarding. She never mentioned her identity. She never demanded special treatment. She simply waited, and with every passing minute, the name hidden behind that reservation carried more weight than anyone aboard the aircraft could possibly imagine. While headquarters raced to understand the reservation, the emotional balance inside the cabin continued shifting in ways no announcement could measure. Nothing looked dramatic to an outside observer, yet almost every quiet glance carried a different meaning than it had only minutes before. The flight attendant walked down the aisle with practiced confidence. Would anyone like another drink? A few passengers nodded politely, but the easy smiles she had received earlier were gone. Instead, people watched. A middle-aged woman caught the black passenger's eye and offered a gentle smile. The woman returned it with a grateful nod. Nearby, an older gentleman stood just long, enough to help place her small travel bag more comfortably beneath the seat. "Thank you," she said, softly. "You shouldn't have to reach for it," he replied. Nothing else needed saying. Across the aisle, a little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom?" "Yes?" If she had the right ticket, why did they move her? His mother's lips parted, but no answer came immediately. Finally, she whispered, "Sometimes adults make unfair decisions." "Why?" She looked toward the woman before answering. "I wish I knew." The child frowned. "That's not nice." His simple words settled over the nearby, rose more heavily than any accusation could. Several passengers lowered their eyes. One. Father quietly told his daughter, "Always judge people by how they treat others, not by what they wear or where they sit." She nodded thoughtfully. Meanwhile, the flight attendant sensed something. Changing. Nobody complained. Nobody argued, yet every trip through the cabin felt different. Conversations. Paused as she passed. Eyes followed her longer than before. She glanced toward the reassigned passenger, expecting frustration, but found only calm dignity. That unexpected composure unsettled her more than anger would have. The woman asked for nothing extra. She simply thanked those who showed ordinary kindness and returned to looking. Through the window, without trying to win anyone over, she slowly earned the respect of nearly everyone watching. Soft. Whispers drifted between neighboring seats. "I don't think this was handled right. I noticed that, too. Something feels off. Confidence." In the earlier decision faded one quiet conversation at a time. What had begun as an ordinary seating change was becoming something much larger. No voices were raised. No public argument erupted. Yet the smallest decision of the morning had already exposed a deeper problem, proving that history often remembers the quiet moments people once believed nobody would ever notice. The quiet support surrounding the woman made the cabin feel different. Yet she remained focused on the clouds beyond the window. Their steady movement stirred memories she had carried for decades, reminding her that this painful moment had not begun with a seat assignment. It had started years before anyone on this aircraft knew her name. As a young professional, she had entered conference rooms where conversations paused the moment she walked inside. Men wearing tailored suits smiled politely, then questioned every qualification listed on her resume. "Are you sure you're leading this project?" "Yes," she had answered calmly. "Interesting." No apology ever followed. Each meeting forced her to prove herself again, even after previous successes. Promotions arrived slowly, delayed by invisible doubts that others never had to overcome. She learned that prejudice rarely announced itself. More often, it hid behind compliments, delays, and polite excuses. Instead of allowing bitterness to define her future, she made a different promise. "If I ever build something of my own," she once told a trusted colleague, "people will be judged by their character, never by assumptions." Years later, she kept that promise. The airline she founded placed dignity beside safety as a core value. Equal treatment was never written merely to satisfy public relations. Every policy reflected memories she wished no employee or passenger would ever have to repeat. Even after retiring from daily leadership, she quietly remained the company's principal owner. Public attention never interested her. She believed organizations revealed their true character only when leaders were absent. That belief had brought her onto today's flight without announcing her identity. She watched the attendant move confidently through the aisle and felt a familiar sadness rather than anger. Different decade, different uniform. The same quiet assumptions. Around her, passengers continued offering respectful smiles, unaware they were witnessing a test she had never intended to give. On the ground, headquarters was still racing toward the truth. In the air, she already understood it. A seat had never been just a seat. It had always been a measure of whether people truly believed the values they claimed to uphold. The realization that a single seat represented the airline's deepest values lingered in the captain's mind only moments later, though he did not yet understand why. The aircraft cruised smoothly above the clouds, the engines humming with steady confidence, when a secure tone interrupted the quiet rhythm inside the cockpit. The captain reached for the communication headset. "Captain Harris speaking." A calm voice answered. "This is Operations Control. We need your full attention." His posture straightened immediately. "Go ahead. We're requesting complete discretion. Do not discuss this over the cabin address system." The captain exchanged a brief glance with his first officer. "Understood." The operations manager continued slowly. "A first-class passenger on your aircraft has been incorrectly identified during boarding. Who?" There was a short pause. "The passenger traveling under reservation number FC2147. The captain opened the electronic manifest. Name?" When headquarters quietly spoke the woman's name, the color faded from his face. He looked at the record once more, hoping he had misread it. He had not. His first officer noticed the sudden silence. "Captain?" He lifted one hand, asking him to wait. "Operations continued. We've verified the executive archive. There is no mistake." The captain closed his eyes for a brief moment. "My God, we need one confirmation. I'm listening. Please confirm her current seat." Immediately, he searched the seating chart. The original first-class assignment appeared beside a reassignment completed only minutes before. "Departure." His voice became quieter. She was moved. Another silence followed. "We were afraid of that." The captain removed the headset carefully instead of dropping. The first officer studied him. "What's happened?" The captain looked toward the closed cockpit door. "This flight just became something else." He reviewed the records again, realizing that what had looked like an ordinary operational decision now represented a profound failure of judgment. Anger flashed briefly across his face, but experience quickly replaced emotion. Reacting without thinking would only make matters worse. "We handle this carefully," he said. The first officer nodded. Moments later, the captain straightened his jacket and stepped into the forward galley. Nearby crew members immediately sensed the difference. Nobody greeted him casually. Nobody smiled. The seriousness in his expression answered questions before anyone asked them. The flight attendant noticed him approaching, but assumed he was performing a routine cabin inspection. She smiled confidently. "Everything's under control, Captain." He looked past her toward the first-class cabin without raising his voice, without revealing a single detail. He understood that the balance of authority had already shifted. The truth no longer depended on opinions, assumptions, or uniforms. It was already moving quietly toward the woman who had endured every moment with remarkable dignity, and nothing aboard that aircraft could stop it now. The captain remained standing near the front galley, watching quietly. No announcement interrupted the flight, yet every member of the cabin crew sensed that something important had changed. The smiles they had worn during boarding now looked careful instead of natural. Conversations ended quickly. Small jokes disappeared. The flight attendant frowned as another crew member answered her question with only a nod. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Just busy," came the reply. She knew that answer was incomplete. Across the galley, the senior purser noticed the captain approaching. His face remained calm, but his eyes carried unusual gravity. She stepped closer. "What is it?" she whispered. He leaned forward. "Don't say anything yet. Just watch carefully." Nothing more was needed. The senior purser slowly nodded, her expression draining of color before she turned back toward the cabin. Passengers noticed the change without understanding it. Newspapers stayed open, movies continued playing, and drinks rested on tray tables, yet more eyes drifted toward the crew than toward the windows. The flight attendant felt those glances. Why was everyone watching? She straightened another blanket, adjusted untouched glasses, and checked overhead bins that needed no attention. Busy hands could not quiet an uneasy mind. One businessman quietly folded his newspaper. Another passenger stopped reading. Entirely, nobody interrupted the silence, because nobody understood it. The woman remained composed. She thanked a passing attendant for fresh tea, then returned her gaze to the clouds beyond the window. She neither smiled with satisfaction nor searched for revenge. Her calm presence contrasted sharply with the uncertainty. Spreading around the uniforms, the attendant approached another coworker. "Did I miss something?" The answer came after a pause. "I don't know." It sounded unconvincing. For the first time since boarding, confidence slipped beneath the surface of professional routine. Every avoided glance, every shortened conversation, and every careful movement quietly challenged the certainty she had carried all morning. The captain remained patient. He understood that truth did not need dramatic speeches. It only needed enough time for people to recognize it themselves. Without a single public accusation, the atmosphere inside first class became noticeably heavier. Before anyone revealed the woman's identity or explained the captain's concern, the foundation supporting the attendant's confidence had already begun collapsing, leaving quiet accountability waiting only a few steps ahead. Even the gentle sound of engines seemed louder against the growing silence. Several passengers exchanged thoughtful looks, then looked away again. Nobody wanted conflict, yet nobody could ignore the feeling that fairness had quietly entered the cabin, asking every witness the same difficult question without speaking a single word aloud. The silence that had settled over first class remained unbroken as the captain left the galley. He walked slowly down the aisle, acknowledging polite smiles with only brief nods. Curious passengers followed his movement, sensing that every measured step carried purpose instead of routine authority. No announcement came, no orders were given. He simply continued forward until he reached the woman's seat. Stopping beside her, he removed his cap as a gesture of respect before speaking in a calm voice. "Ma'am, may I speak with you for a moment?" The woman looked up from the window. "Of course, Captain." She met his eyes without bitterness or triumph. Her expression reflected the same quiet composure she had carried since boarding, as though patience had prepared her for this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. The captain inclined his head slightly. "I owe you my sincere attention." Nearby, passengers exchanged silent glances. Only minutes earlier, many had watched her being questioned over a boarding pass. Now the captain stood beside her with unmistakable respect, and the contrast forced everyone to reconsider the story they believed they had understood. Across the aisle, the flight attendant paused while pouring coffee. She frowned. Why was the captain speaking to this passenger so personally? She tried to continue serving, but her attention kept drifting toward the conversation. The captain lowered his voice. "Ms. Carter, headquarters contacted me. The attendant." Heard only the name. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand. "Ms. Carter?" The name echoed inside her mind. Recognition. Struck with frightening speed, she remembered orientation. Sessions years earlier, she remembered framed photographs in the executive hallway. She remembered stories about the retired founder who insisted that every passenger deserved equal dignity. Her breathing became uneven. No, the whispered word escaped before she realized she had spoken. Every decision from that Morning replayed through her thoughts. The repeated ticket check, the cold tone, the reassigned seat, the certainty she had mistaken for professionalism. None of it looked reasonable anymore. Her uniform suddenly felt far less important than the truth. Standing only a few feet away, passengers noticed the change. Immediately, no one heard every sentence, exchanged between the captain and the woman. Yet, they no longer needed explanations. Respect had shifted visibly. Authority had changed hands without argument. The woman remained seated, calm and gracious, while the captain listened. More than he spoke, the attendant lowered her eyes. She finally understood that the quiet passenger she had underestimated was not powerful because of a title. She had always carried genuine authority through character. Recognition had finally arrived. But it had arrived far too late to erase the choice that everyone in the cabin had already witnessed, and that quiet mistake could never again be undone. The captain remained beside the woman for several quiet seconds before drawing a slow breath. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered anymore. Even the soft hum of the engines seemed distant as every pair of eyes waited for whatever came next. The silence itself had become a witness, asking everyone to listen before another mistake could be made. With measured calm, the captain turned toward her. "Ma'am, on behalf of everyone representing this airline, I offer my deepest apology. You should have been treated with fairness and respect from the moment you boarded. We failed you today, and that responsibility belongs to us." His voice never rose, yet every word settled across the cabin with unmistakable weight. No applause followed. No relieved laughter broke the tension. Passengers remained motionless because they understood this was not a victory to celebrate. It was the acknowledgement of pain that should never have existed. The quiet respect surrounding the apology carried greater meaning than any emotional reaction could have expressed. Only a few steps away, the flight attendant stood frozen. The policies she had relied upon no longer offered comfort. Looking at the floor, she replayed each choice she had made since boarding. For the first time, procedure felt empty because it could no longer hide the personal judgment behind her actions. She tried to speak, but nothing came. Regret slowly replaced certainty across her face. Fear, shame, and disbelief appeared one after another without a single excuse escaping her lips. Those changing expressions revealed an inner collapse that no explanation could soften or erase before everyone watching. The woman accepted the apology with quiet grace. She gave a small nod and simply replied, "Thank you for acknowledging what happened." She asked for no punishment and no public embarrassment. Her dignity reminded everyone that real justice restores fairness instead of creating another moment of humiliation. Around the cabin, several passengers lowered their eyes. Their thoughts drifted back to the boarding gate, where silence had felt easier than speaking, without blame from anyone. They recognized how quickly ordinary people could become part of injustice simply by convincing themselves someone else would act first. The remaining crew exchanged thoughtful glances. None of them saw this flight as routine anymore. It had become a lasting lesson about responsibility, courage, and the cost of allowing quiet assumptions to shape decisions that touched another person's dignity without anyone questioning them. No arguments followed the apology. None were necessary. Truth had already spoken through calm voices, visible regret, and patient restraint. The loudest sound inside the aircraft was the quiet understanding spreading from one row to the next, reaching every witness without demanding another word. When the captain returned to the cockpit, nothing about the seating chart mattered anymore. What every passenger carried forward was the memory of dignity overcoming authority through composure alone. In complete silence, justice finally found its place, leaving no room for denial, only reflection and lasting change. The woman slowly rose from her seat, smoothing her jacket before looking across the quiet cabin. She never hurried toward the attention now surrounding her. Her steady posture carried calm instead of anger, reminding everyone watching that genuine strength often appears through patience, restraint, and quiet confidence rather than triumph. The aircraft had finally reached the gate, but nobody moved with the usual urgency of passengers preparing to leave. The cabin remained unusually still, as if everyone understood that the journey had ended physically, yet something much larger had just begun. The silence carried the weight of everything witnessed. Passengers slowly gathered their belongings, but their attention remained focused on the front of the cabin. No one rushed forward. No one pushed toward the exit. The normal impatience of landing had disappeared. replaced by quiet curiosity about what would happen after the doors opened and the outside world finally saw what had happened. Before the aircraft even reached the terminal, the recorded footage had already traveled far beyond the people who witnessed it. Thousands of viewers continued sharing the video, analyzing every pause, every expression, and every moment where silence had revealed more than words. Online discussions grew rapidly. Travelers shared similar experiences, former passengers described uncomfortable encounters, and aviation communities questioned how a company promoting fairness could allow such moments to happen. The incident was no longer limited to one flight. It had become a conversation about trust. Beyond the terminal windows, cameras waited. Reporters stood near the arrival area, preparing questions before passengers even stepped onto the walkway. Airport employees watched from a distance, realizing that the situation had moved beyond internal conversations. Public attention had already arrived. Several airline executives entered the terminal with serious expressions. Their usual confidence was replaced by visible concern. There were no prepared smiles or carefully planned greetings. They understood that every decision made after this moment would determine whether the company accepted responsibility or protected itself. As passengers began leaving the aircraft, the captain walked beside the woman instead of ahead of her. He offered no dramatic statement and made no attempt to draw attention. The simple gesture showed respect in its purest form, allowing his actions to speak before any official explanation followed. Behind them, the flight attendant stepped into the terminal, surrounded by uncomfortable silence. Coworkers who once exchanged casual conversations now kept their distance. Nobody insulted her. Nobody shouted. Yet, the absence of support revealed a reality she could no longer ignore. Inside the crew corridor, whispers replaced the confidence that had existed earlier. Employees discussed what they had seen, what they had ignored, and what they should have questioned sooner. The incident forced them to look beyond one decision and examine the culture that allowed it to happen. Before leaving the airport, executives released a statement announcing a full investigation. They promised transparency, accountability, and a careful review of every detail. For the first time, the airline was not controlling the story. It was responding to it. Investigators collected reports, security recordings, passenger statements, and crew communications. Every piece of evidence would now be compared against the values the airline claimed to protect. The difference between written promises and real experiences was finally being placed under the spotlight. Every passenger watched without speaking. Many expected sharp criticism or visible frustration after everything that had happened. Instead, she allowed a thoughtful silence to settle over the cabin before meeting their eyes. That simple pause invited reflection first, making every listener value the words still waiting to come. She finally spoke in a gentle voice. Leadership begins with respect, not recognition. The sentence was neither loud nor dramatic, yet it reached every corner of first class. In one moment, she reminded everyone that dignity should never depend upon titles, uniforms, wealth, or influence alone. She turned briefly toward the flight attendant. One mistake should never become someone's entire identity. What matters is whether we learn after facing the truth. Her words held accountability without cruelty, separating justice from revenge and showing compassion without excusing the harm that had already been done. The flight attendant lowered her eyes before anyone asked. No supervisor demanded another apology, and no passenger called for punishment. Yet, the woman's unexpected compassion made regret feel even heavier. Conscience replaced fear, revealing consequences that reached deeper than any formal discipline ever could have achieved. The cabin had quietly prepared itself for confrontation, but mercy arrived instead. Several passengers felt tears gathering without fully understanding why. Watching forgiveness unfold with honesty carried greater emotional weight than anger ever could. Grace transformed the atmosphere, replacing tension with thoughtful reflection and shared humanity among strangers. She spoke once more. I built my life proving that opportunity should never depend on someone else's assumptions. Every person deserves fairness before anyone knows their name. Those simple words connected decades of perseverance with the quiet lesson unfolding inside the aircraft for every witness present. Standing respectfully nearby, the captain realized this conversation had become far greater than an airline incident. Policies could encourage fairness, but only personal character could protect it when pressure, assumptions, and unchecked authority quietly influenced everyday decisions that affected another person's dignity and trust forever. Silence settled once again. This time, passengers remembered her message instead of the earlier humiliation. The reassigned seat no longer defined the journey. Her calm wisdom became the lasting memory, quietly replacing discomfort with reflection and encouraging everyone aboard to reconsider how respect should always begin naturally. As the aircraft continued toward its destination, accountability remained firmly established without bitterness taking control. The woman reclaimed something greater than a first-class seat. By choosing dignity over retaliation, she transformed a painful injustice into a lasting lesson, proving compassion could become the strongest form of justice itself. The conversation surrounding the video slowly changed as people looked beyond the shock of the moment. What began as a widely shared recording became something far more important. Viewers stopped searching only for someone to blame and started asking deeper questions about how quiet discrimination could continue behind polite words and professional behavior. The footage became evidence of a larger problem. Comment sections that once focused on anger began discussing accountability, workplace culture, and the responsibility of companies to protect every passenger equally. The video no longer represented one uncomfortable encounter. It represented countless experiences that had remained unheard for years. Inside the crew lounge, the flight attendant sat alone with the silence she had once created for someone else. She watched the recording again, but this time she did not focus on her own actions. She watched the passenger's face, the hesitation, and the dignity she had overlooked. For the first time, she saw the situation from another perspective. The confidence that had guided her earlier decisions began to disappear. Regret slowly replaced the certainty that everything she had done was justified. No investigator had forced that realization. It arrived quietly from within. Every small detail returned. The extra pause before speaking, the assumptions made without evidence, the way she had treated a passenger differently without admitting why. Those memories replayed repeatedly, becoming a personal examination more difficult than any formal interview. Yet nobody celebrated her pain. The passengers who witnessed the event did not demand humiliation. Executives did not use her mistake as a simple public relations strategy. The focus remained on understanding what happened and preventing it from happening again. Meanwhile, the woman who had experienced the injustice avoided turning the moment into personal victory. Away from cameras and headlines, she continued asking a larger question. How could an organization create an environment where respect existed naturally instead of only appearing after someone powerful was affected? That question forced executives to examine the airline beyond one employee. They reviewed training programs, leadership decisions, reporting systems, and workplace expectations. The investigation revealed that individual choices mattered, but systems also shaped what employees felt comfortable doing. As the review continued, employees began sharing concerns they had kept hidden. Some described moments they had witnessed but never reported. Others admitted they stayed quiet because speaking up felt risky. Slowly, the truth expanded beyond one flight and one decision. The airline realized apologies would not repair damaged trust alone. Passengers needed actions, not carefully prepared statements. Real change required transparency, fair treatment, and accountability that continued even when cameras were no longer present. Before the investigation reached its conclusion, transformation had already started. Employees watched situations differently. Passengers questioned unfair treatment more openly. Leaders understood that culture was built through everyday choices. One quiet moment of discrimination had created a much larger demand for dignity, fairness, and lasting change. The future of the airline would depend on whether those lessons became permanent actions instead of temporary. Promises made during a crisis. The suspension letter arrived. Without the dramatic confrontation many people expected. There were no cameras waiting, no angry voices surrounding her, and no public scene created for attention. It was simply a document placed in her hands, carrying a decision that changed everything. One signature had removed the certainty she once carried. She stared at the paper longer than she expected. The uniform that once represented experience, responsibility, and authority suddenly felt different. The weight she felt was not from losing a position. It came from understanding that trust, once damaged, could not be restored with a simple explanation. When she entered the crew locker room, the familiar sounds were gone. The conversations that once filled the space had disappeared. Empty benches and quiet corners surrounded her as she walked toward her locker. The room looked exactly the same, yet it felt like a completely different place. Coworkers passed by without confrontation. Nobody shouted, Nobody insulted her. Some avoided eye contact, while others offered only brief nods before continuing on their way. That silence affected her more than anger would have, because it showed that people were struggling with what they now believed about her character. Every shortened conversation carried a message. The people who once trusted her judgment were no longer certain. The absence of support revealed something she had never considered before. Respect was not protected by a uniform. It was earned through the choices made when nobody was watching. Standing in front of the mirror, she looked at her reflection and saw more than a tired employee. She saw someone forced to examine parts of herself she had ignored for years. The professional image remained, but the confidence behind it had weakened. Slowly, she removed her uniform jacket and folded it carefully. The action was simple, yet it felt meaningful. She realized the clothing had never created authority. The uniform only represented a responsibility that depended on fairness, patience, and humanity. The sound of nearby lockers closing brought back memories of the flight, the boarding line, the passenger's calm expression, the moments where she could have chosen differently, but did not. Each memory returned with painful honesty. What surprised her most was that nobody celebrated her downfall. Her coworkers did not seek revenge. Their distance remained respectful, reflecting the same dignity she had failed to show earlier. That realization made the consequences feel even heavier. Leaving the locker room without the uniform, she understood that accountability did not end with suspension. A jacket could be removed, but lessons followed a person wherever they went. Outside the employee entrance, she stopped for a moment. For the first time, she stopped searching for explanations. She accepted that change would not begin with defending herself. It would begin by admitting the truth. The video did not disappear after the aircraft landed. Instead, it continued traveling across screens, reaching people who had never heard the woman's name before. What began as a passenger recording became a symbol of a larger conversation about fairness, respect, and hidden bias. Within hours, news outlets began examining the incident from every angle. The focus moved beyond the flight attendant's decision and toward deeper questions about company culture. Viewers wanted to understand how a situation like this could happen inside an organization that publicly promised equal treatment. As attention increased, former passengers started sharing memories they had carried quietly for years. Their stories described uncomfortable moments, unfair assumptions, and situations where they questioned whether speaking up would make any difference. Together, those experiences revealed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Investigators returned to old complaint records that had once been considered separate incidents. Reading them side by side changed the meaning of each report. What looked like individual misunderstandings began appearing as repeated warning signs that had been overlooked for far too long. Employees also began speaking with greater honesty. Some admitted they had noticed similar behavior, but remained silent because they feared consequences. Their statements were not filled with anger. They were filled with regret, showing how silence had allowed problems to continue. Facing growing pressure, airline leadership chose a different path. Instead of denying responsibility, executives announced reforms, stronger reporting systems, and deeper reviews of workplace practices. They understood that trust could not be repaired through statements alone. It required consistent action. The woman never wanted fame from the incident. When asked to speak publicly, she focused on change rather than herself. She explained that the goal was simple. Every passenger deserved dignity before anyone knew their name, position, or influence. Over time, public conversations became less focused on punishment and more focused on responsibility. People discussed personal choices, workplace courage, and the importance of challenging unfair treatment when it first appears. The image people remembered most was not anger. It was her calm response. Her restraint became a reminder that dignity can reveal truth without creating more harm. One flight had exposed failures hidden for years, but it also created an opportunity for change. The story remained a lesson that meaningful justice begins when people finally choose to see what they once ignored. The lessons from that day continued influencing employees, passengers, and leaders, proving that accountability grows when courage replaces comfortable silence. Months after the incident, the cameras disappeared and the headlines slowly moved toward other stories. Yet inside the airline, the work continued. Leaders understood that real change could not exist only when the public was watching. It had to appear in everyday choices made quietly behind the scenes. The company began examining every part of the passenger experience. From boarding procedures to customer interactions, executives searched for places where assumptions could influence decisions. Old habits were challenged, and policies were rewritten to ensure fairness was not just promised, but practiced. Training sessions changed completely. Employees were no longer expected to simply memorize company rules and repeat prepared messages. Instead, they listened to real experiences from passengers and coworkers. These conversations created understanding that no manual could fully provide. For years, many people had remained silent because they believed their voices would disappear inside large systems. Now, employees and travelers found spaces where their concerns could be heard without fear. Their stories helped shape improvements that reached beyond one incident. Leadership also learned an important lesson. Respect could not depend on campaigns, advertisements, or carefully written statements. It had to appear during ordinary moments when employees faced pressure, difficult choices, or situations where nobody expected to be held accountable. Slowly, passengers who once felt ignored began noticing differences. A warmer greeting, a fairer response, a willingness to listen before judging. These small actions rebuilt trust one moment at a time, showing that meaningful change often grows through consistency rather than dramatic announcements. New employees entered a workplace that carried lessons from the past. Trainers explained that professionalism was not only about efficiency or appearance. It was about understanding the responsibility that came with serving people from every background with equal care. The impact of one flight continued far beyond the passengers who experienced it. Every new employee trained, every improved procedure created, and every fair decision made carried a connection to that moment. A painful mistake became a reason to protect future travelers. The woman at the center of the story never considered herself a symbol. She never wanted attention or praise. Her greatest achievement was knowing that others might avoid the same pain because people finally chose to listen. Years later, the most important lesson remained simple. First class was never truly about the seat, the ticket, or the privilege attached to a name. It was about character. The highest measure of any person or organization was found in how they treated others when no reward, recognition, or camera was present. Away from crowded terminals and cameras, the consequences continued quietly beyond public attention. The former attendant returned to ordinary life where silence replaced the constant movement of airports. Without a uniform or schedule, she faced the memories she could no longer avoid. Days became slower as familiar routines lost their comfort. Family members spoke carefully, unsure whether encouragement or honesty was needed most. She noticed the distance in their voices and understood that trust, damaged by one decision, required patience to rebuild with time. Each morning brought another chance to reflect on the moment she once considered ordinary. Small details returned unexpectedly, from her tone to her assumptions. She finally recognized that harm often begins when people stop questioning their own choices and accept unfair instincts. The world eventually moved forward to different stories, but her personal lesson remained. She no longer searched for excuses or explanations. Instead, she searched within herself for honesty and a deeper understanding of how her actions had affected someone she never knew. Old memories of the flight no longer represented professional pride alone. They became reminders of responsibility and humility. She realized that experience and position could never excuse a moment when another person's dignity was overlooked and ignored. The woman she had once judged, without knowing, became the person she respected most. Her calm response revealed a strength that anger could never achieve. That lesson stayed with her, showing that humanity must come before assumptions. She began noticing ordinary moments differently, watching how people were treated when nobody expected recognition. Every interaction became an opportunity to practice the fairness she had once failed to provide during that important flight. The hardest part was accepting that good intentions could still create painful outcomes. She learned that character was not proven by past achievements, but by the willingness to admit mistakes and change behavior afterward. Her journey did not erase what happened, and she never pretended it could. Instead, she carried the memory as a reminder that every person carries a story invisible to others, deserving respect before judgment. In the end, the greatest transformation came from seeing people completely instead of through assumptions. The cost of looking without understanding had been painful, but the lesson remained powerful. True respect begins when every person is valued before anything else. Years later, she would remember that flight not because of the embarrassment, but because it taught her the importance of empathy. She finally understood that seeing humanity clearly was the first step toward real lasting change. Away from busy airports and crowded terminals, the former attendant returned home to unfamiliar silence, where reflection replaced routine movements. Without uniforms or announcements, each quiet room reminded her that consequences often continue long afterward. She stopped measuring days through schedules and flights because one memory remained constant. The moment she judged the passenger too quickly returned repeatedly, forcing her to confront choices she once considered normal, but now questioned. Her family still offered support, yet conversations carried a different weight. Loved ones avoided pretending everything was unchanged because they understood growth required honesty. Their careful words reflected concern for someone discovering painful truths within. Old photographs no longer represented only achievements or successful years. Each image carried questions about compassion and choices. She wondered whether the person behind the uniform had always matched the kindness people believed they saw. The uniform disappeared, but responsibility remained beside her every day. Authority had ended, yet accountability continued quietly. She learned that character follows people beyond titles and positions, revealing truth after public attention has finally faded. No courtroom delivered a harsher judgment than her own conscience. There were no crowds demanding answers outside her home. Still, her thoughts challenged every assumption she made and exposed the bias hidden beneath ordinary decisions. The woman's calm response remained the strongest memory she carried forward. She remembered dignity instead of anger, compassion instead of revenge. That peaceful strength revealed a lesson confrontation could never teach with the same power. For the first time, she viewed the event through another person's experience. The change seemed simple but transformed everything. She recognized how assumptions could replace understanding when people stopped listening and started judging too quickly. The excuses she once trusted slowly disappeared beneath honest reflection. Pressure and routine no longer felt like complete explanations. She accepted responsibility because real change required truth before comfort and courage, before avoiding difficult answers. She finally understood respect should never depend on names or achievements. Wealth and influence could reveal nothing about worth. Every person deserved dignity immediately because humanity existed before recognition ever arrived through status or power. Losing her position was painful, but it was not the deepest cost she faced. The hardest lesson came from realizing one decision had challenged values she believed represented her identity and personal sense of fairness. The story ended without revenge or celebration. Instead, it revealed transformation through reflection and humility. One woman showed dignity, while another learned empathy. Together, they proved that humanity grows when people choose to see others.